Some stories don't begin with a scream. They begin with a promise. This is not a story about love. It's a story about how love can slowly turn into silence, into control, into something you no longer recognize. She didn't plan to stay. She didn't plan to lie. And she definitely didn't plan for that night by the river. But some choices don't feel dangerous when you make them. Only when you try to live with them afterward. If you've ever trusted the wrong person. If you've ever ignored the voice in your head telling you to leave. Then stay with me. Because this story doesn't ask who was right. It asks something far more uncomfortable. How far would you go, before you admit you can't go back?
People think loneliness announces itself loudly. They imagine tears, shaking hands, desperate voices calling into the dark. They are wrong. Loneliness is quiet. It sits beside you while you smile. It listens while you speak about ordinary things. And when no one is watching, it whispers that you are invisible. I learned this early. I grew up in Grey Haven, a coastal town where the sea never sleeps and neither do regrets. The houses there lean toward the Watt eras if they're tired of standing. Paint peels. Promises do the same. My mother used to say the town was cursed, not by ghosts, but by people who stayed too long. She left when I was 13. No note. No explanation. Just an empty room and a smell of perfume that faded faster than my faith in permanence. My father stayed. Physically. Emotionally, he had drowned long before. So I learned to survive by becoming what people needed me to be. Quiet when silence was required. Warm when affection was expected. Grateful when help came with invisible strings attached. By the time I turned 24, I had mastered the art of appearing harmless. That was when I met Julian Hale. It happened in Northbridge, a city that smells of rain and old books. I had moved there for university, studying literature. Not because I loved it, but because words were safer than people. Words don't leave unless you close the book. Julian was a visiting lecturer. He was everything I was not. Confident, respected, grounded. His voice carried authority, but his eyes carried kindness. The dangerous kind, the kind that makes you forget to protect yourself. After one of his lectures, I stayed behind. I told myself it was to ask about an assignment. That was the first lie. He noticed me immediately. Some people have that gift. They make you feel seen without effort. "You're Tim, aren't you?" he said. I nodded, surprised. I had never been memorable. "You write like someone who's hiding something," he added, smiling gently. That us usually means honesty or pain. I laughed. Another lie. That conversation lasted 10 minutes, but it changed the architecture of my life. Over the next weeks, we talked more. About books. About exile. About the strange comfort of being misunderstood. He never asked about my family, and I never offered. We respected each other's silences. When he invited me for coffee, I hesitated. Not because I didn't want to go, but because part of me already knew this would cost something. Julian lived alone in a narrow townhouse near the river. It was filled with art, plants, and the smell of freshly brewed tea. A home that had been lived in gently. "You can come here any time," he said casually. "I know student housing can feel temporary." Temporary. That word lodged itself inside me like a promise. I began spending more time there. Studying, eating, sleeping on the couch when trains stopped running. He never made me feel like he a burden. In fact, he seemed grateful for my presence, as if I filled a quiet space he hadn't known how to name. I told him small truths about myself. Enough to seem vulnerable. Not enough to be known. He told me real ones. About a failed relationship. About aging in a profession obsessed with youth. About the fear of becoming irrelevant. I listened carefully. Love, I learned, is often just attention mixed with timing. And I was very good at paying attention. One night, during a storm, the power went out. We sat in candlelight, shadows dancing across the walls. Julian spoke about fate, how some people enter our lives not by accident, but necessity. When he looked at me, I felt something open. Or break. He reached for my hand. I didn't pull away. That was the moment everything became inevitable. What Julian didn't know, what no one ever knows at the beginning, is that survival teaches you skills that look a lot like cruelty. And affection, when offered to the wrong person, can become a weapon. I did care for him. That much was true. But care is not the same as innocence. And this story begins with love. But it does not promise to end there. There is a moment in every fragile connection when comfort quietly replaces caution. You stop asking why someone is kind to you. You start asking how you lived without it. I didn't notice when Julian's house stopped feeling like a place I visited and started feeling like a place I returned to. It happened gradually. My toothbrush appeared in his bathroom without discussion. My books migrated from my bag to his shelves. My name began to sound natural in his mouth. "You don't have to rush off," he would say, lightly. And I wouldn't. At university, I existed on the edges. Friendly faces, shallow conversations. No one asked where I went at night. No one noticed when I didn't come back to the dorms. Julian noticed everything. He remembered how I took my tea. He remembered which passages in books made me quiet. He noticed when I lied, not because he confronted me, but because his eyes softened, as if he were protecting me from myself. That softness terrified me, because it felt like something I might destroy. One evening, while we cooked dinner together, he asked casually, "Do you ever think about your mother?" The knife slipped in my hand. Just slightly. Enough to sting. "She left," I said. That was true. He didn't press for details. Instead, he placed a hand over mine, steadying it. "Some people don't know how to stay," he said. I wondered which of us he meant. That night, I dreamed of Grey Haven. The sea swallowing the town slowly, house by house. When I woke, Julian was already awake, reading beside me. The intimacy of it, waking without explanation, felt illegal. "You talk in your sleep," he said with a smile. "What do I say?" Nothing I could understand. "But you sounded afraid." I turned away, embarrassed by a vulnerability I hadn't consented to. From then on, I curated my honesty more carefully. I learned which parts of myself made him feel needed, which silences invited protection, which smiles reassured him that he was still relevant, still Desir. He started introducing me to colleagues. "This is Tim," he'd say. "He's brilliant, brilliant." No one had ever used that word for me before. When he offered to help me with rent, I refused at first, the way people do when they want to appear principled. But student loans don't respect pride. "I don't want you to feel indebted," he said gently. "I just want you to feel safe." Safe. Another word that lodged itself inside me. So I accepted. And with acceptance came a quiet shift. I became careful not to upset him. He became careful not to lose me. That balance, fragile, unspoken, held us together like glass. Sometimes, late at night, I would watch him sleep and feel something like guilt brush against me. But guilt is easy to ignore when survival is involved. Julian talked about the future. About buying a place closer to the river. About stability. I nodded at the right moments. Smiled when expected. But somewhere beneath the affection, another voice had begun to speak. It asked dangerous questions. What happens when this ends? What do you do when comfort becomes expectation? And how far would you go to avoid being left again? I didn't answer those questions yet. But they were patient. And patience, I had learned, is the most dangerous emotion of all. Power never announces itself. It slips into a room disguised as generosity, sits between two people, and waits to be acknowledged. Julian never told me what to do. That was the genius of it. He simply arranged the world in a way that made my choices smaller. When I stayed out late with classmates, he didn't ask questions. He just looked relieved when I returned. When I mentioned applying for a semester abroad, he smiled, and then spent the evening talking about how lonely the winters in Northbridge could be. "I worry about you," he would say, softly. "Not I need you. Not don't leave. Just worry." And I learned quickly that guilt is more effective than command. My days began to orbit around his schedule. I timed my classes so I could have lunch with him. I turned down invitations without thinking. When people asked why I was always busy, I shrugged. "I've got someone," I said. It sounded like love. Inside, it felt like a contract. The money he gave me helped. More than I admitted. It paid rent, books, food. Stability has a way of dulling your sense of urgency. You stop imagining alternatives. Julian never reminded me of what he provided. He didn't need to. I reminded myself. Sometimes, I caught my reflection in his hallway mirror and barely recognized the person staring back. I dressed differently now. Spoke more carefully. Laughed at the right moments. I was becoming curated. One night, after a small argument, about nothing, really, he apologized first. "I don't want to pressure you," he said. "I know I'm older. I know this might be uneven. The word lingered between us. I told him it didn't matter. That I chose him. That was mostly true. But choice is complicated when the alternative is falling. As weeks passed, Julian's affection deepened into something heavier. He asked where I was going, not out of suspicion, but concern. He worried about my health, my future, my exposure to people who didn't understand me. "Not everyone wants the best for you," he said once, tracing a thumb along my wrist. I wondered if he included himself in that statement. There were moments, small, almost invisible, when I felt a tightening inside my chest. Like a room with no windows. But then he would smile, or touch my shoulder, or praise something I'd written. And the feeling would pass. Affection can anesthetize instinct. I started telling him less about my thoughts. Not because I didn't trust him, but because I didn't want to upset the balance. I sensed that he needed me in a particular way. And I was very good at being needed. But there is a cost to performance. At night, when Julian slept, I lay awake rehearsing versions of myself. Who I would be if I stayed. Who I might become if I left. The second version felt vague, frightening, unfinished. The first was already shaped. One evening, Julian asked, "Do you ever think about leaving Northbridge?" The question startled me. "Sometimes," I said carefully. His silence was immediate. Not angry, not hurt, just quiet. After a pause, he said, "I suppose everyone imagines escape. Escape." I wondered if that's what he thought I was doing. Escaping him. Or if he was afraid that one day I would. That night, as he slept beside me, I realized something uncomfortable. I was no longer afraid of losing Julian. I was afraid of what I might do to avoid it. And that fear, cold, precise, unflinching, felt like power. There is a line most people believe they would never cross. They imagine it glowing red, unmistakable, impossible to miss. In reality, it's thin, quiet, almost polite. And by the time you notice it beneath your feet, you've already stepped over. The first time I lied to Julian deliberately, it wasn't to protect myself. It was to test him. A classmate invited me to a small gathering. Nothing dramatic, just drinks and laughter and the soft chaos of people my age. I wanted to go. Not because I needed escape, but because I needed proof that I still could. When Julian asked about my evening plans, I said, "Library." He smiled. "Don't stay too late." The lie sat easily on my tongue. At the party, I felt strangely weightless. No expectations. No careful just noise and bodies and temporary connections. Someone asked about my life, and for once, I answered vaguely. Felt like freedom. But as the night wore on, something else crept in. Curiosity. Would Julian worry? Would he wait up? Would he notice my absence differently if I were honest? When I returned close to midnight, the lights in the townhouse were still on. Julian was in the living room, reading, or pretending to. He looked up immediately. "You're late," he said gently. The gentleness was worse than anger. "I lost track of time," I replied. Another lied. He nodded, stood, and kissed my forehead. "No interrogación. No accusation. I'm just glad you're safe." Safe. That word again. Always that word. I went to bed unsettled, not by guilt, but by disappointment. He hadn't questioned me. Over the next weeks, I lied more. Small things. Inconsequential things. Where I'd been. Who I'd spoken to. Each lie was a pebble dropped into still water. And each time, Julian responded the same way. Calm, trusting, open. It made me reckless. I began to push gently against the edges of his patience. I stayed out later. I canceled plans at the last minute. I watched his reactions carefully, cataloging them like data. He blamed himself for every shift. I know I can be overwhelming, he said once. I don't want to trap you. Trap. The word sparked something sharp and electric inside me. You don't, I said quickly. And meant, not yet. The truth, the one I never spoke, was this. I needed to know how much space I had to move without losing him. Dependence is not built through force. It's built through imbalance. And I was learning how to tilt the scale. One night, during a rare moment of honesty, Julian admitted something that changed everything. I don't know who I'd be without you now, he said quietly. You make the days feel anchored. Anchored, I felt it then. Unmistakably. The shift. Where once I had needed him more, now he needed me. That realization should have frightened me. Instead, it steadied me. From that moment on, I stopped imagining escape. I started imagining leverage. And somewhere deep inside, a part of me, old, practiced, survival-hardened, whispered that this was the safer position to be in. Because people who fear abandonment will do almost anything to avoid it. And people who are needed are rarely the ones who get left. Being needed is intoxicating. It doesn't arrive like desire. Fast, reckless, burning. It arrives slowly, settling into your bones, convincing you that you matter in a way no one else ever has. Julian needed me now. Not loudly, not desperately, but completely. I saw it in the way he waited for my reactions before finishing a sentence. In how his moods adjusted themselves around my presence and the subtle anxiety that crept into his voice whenever I mentioned plans that didn't include him. You don't have to change anything for me, he would say. But he already had. And so had I. The strange thing was, I didn't feel powerful in the way I had imagined. I felt responsible. As if his emotional balance had been placed carefully into my hands without my consent. That responsibility pressed on me at night. Some evenings, I stayed just to keep the peace. Some mornings, I woke beside him feeling like a promise I hadn't agreed to make. Still, I stayed. Because leaving would have meant cruelty. And cruelty, I told myself, was worse than dishonesty. That's how I justified it. Julian began talking about permanence more openly. Northbridge suits you, he said once, pouring wine. You're calmer here. Calmer. I wondered if he mistook stillness for peace. He spoke about introducing me to his sister. About holidays. About what life might look like if I didn't have to worry so much about money or uncertainty. Each suggestion came wrapped in concern, not control. But concern can be a cage if you stay inside it long enough. One afternoon, while he was teaching, I wandered through his study. I had been there countless times, but something compelled me to look closer. Not at the books, but at the drawers. I opened one-dot letters, neatly stacked, tied with a faded ribbon. They were old, years old, written by someone who had once loved him deeply, someone who had left. I didn't read them all. I didn't need to. What mattered was not the content, but the evidence. Julian had been abandoned before. The knowledge settled quietly inside me, rearranging things. That night, I watched him more carefully than usual. How long did it take you to feel normal again? I asked casually. After what? After your last relationship ended. He hesitated. Just a fraction. I'm not sure I ever did, he admitted. Some absences don't close. They just echo. Echo. That word felt like an opening. I touched his hand. You're not alone now. I meant it. But I also understood what it cost. From then on, I became more deliberate. I praised him when he felt uncertain, withdrew slightly when he seemed too secure. I spoke of futures that included him, vaguely enough to remain flexible. I never promised anything. That was important. Promises create expectations. Hope creates patience. And patience is easier to manage. Still, something inside me resisted. There were moments, brief, sharp, when I saw myself clearly. The calculations, the emotional pacing, the way I adjusted my affection like volume control. In those moments, I felt something close to disgust. But survival has a way of dulling moral clarity. One evening, Julian said something that changed the tone of everything. "I've been thinking," he began. "Maybe it would make sense if you took a break from school next semester. Just temporarily. You've been under so much pressure." My chest tightened. A break. Dependence doesn't demand. It suggests. "I can support us," he continued quickly. "Until you feel ready." Us. The word felt heavy. I smiled. "I'll think about it." That night, sleep wouldn't come. Because for the first time, I saw the future clearly. Not as safety, but as narrowing corridors. And worse, I realized that Julian believed he was saving me. People who believe they are saving you don't see the harm they cause. And people who are being saved often forget how to leave. By morning, I had made a decision. I would not let my life become smaller, no matter what it cost. But I didn't yet know how far I was willing to go to protect that decision. And that uncertainty, dangerous, unresolved, was the beginning of something irreversible.
There are thoughts that pass through the mind like strangers on a train platform. You notice them. You judge them. And then you let them go. Then there are thoughts that sit down beside you. They don't speak at first. They wait. The idea didn't arrive suddenly. It formed the way fog does, slowly, invisibly, until the world looks unfamiliar. It began with avoidance. I delayed conversations. Changed the subject when Julian spoke about the future. I told myself it was temporary, that once exams were over, once things settled, clarity would return. But clarity never came. Julian, meanwhile, grew quieter. Not colder, just careful. As if he sensed a shift and was afraid to touch it. One evening, he asked, "Are you happy?" The question was simple. Honest. I should have answered it honestly too. "I think so," I said. The pause afterward was long enough to matter. "That I don't want to be the reason you stay if your heart isn't here," he said softly. I felt a surge of panic, sharp, irrational. "No," I said too quickly. "You're not." That was when the thought first sat down beside me. What if there were another way? Not leaving. Not confrontation. Not cruelty. Just release. That I hated myself for thinking it. Immediately. Viscerally. I told myself I was exhausted. Overwhelmed. That people in difficult situations imagine impossible solutions all the time. Still, the thought stayed. Julian began experiencing headaches. He blamed stress. Long hours. I made him tea, massaged his temples, told him to rest more. Caretaking is a powerful disguise. At the pharmacy one afternoon, while picking up painkillers for him, I noticed something behind the counter, a small sign warning about dosage. How certain medications interact. How excess can blur into danger. The thought didn't grow louder. It grew clearer. I didn't act. Not then. Not even close. But I started paying attention. I noticed which pills he took. How often. I noticed that he trusted me with his routines, that sometimes he let me prepare his evening medication when he was too tired. "You're better at remembering these things," he'd say. "Trust is not blind. It is given." At night, guilt kept me awake. I imagined futures branching out, one where I left and destroyed him emotionally, another where I stayed and disappeared inside his life. And then there was the third path. The one I refused to look at directly. Weeks passed. Julian's sister visited once. She was kind. Sharp-eyed. She watched us with a look that felt like assessment. "You seem important to him," she said to me privately. "I try to be," I replied. It wasn't a lie, the headaches worsened. Julian joked about aging. About how the body betrays us before we're ready. I laughed when expected. Held him when needed. Inside, something hardened. Not malice. Resolve. Because the truth was this. I didn't want to hurt Julian. But I also couldn't let my life be absorbed by his fear of being alone. And when you believe there are only two outcomes, destruction or disappearance, the mind searches desperately for a third. I began researching. Casually. Abstractly. As if curiosity alone could keep my hands clean. What I learned frightened me. Not because it was complicated. But because it wasn't. Accidents happen every day. Especially to people already unwell. Especially to people who live alone, quietly, without witnesses. The thought finally spoke. You could make this gentle. I stood in the shower one morning, water pounding against my skull, and whispered aloud. No. But refusal, I discovered, doesn't erase a thought. It only delays it. And the more I delayed, the more certain I became of one thing. Whatever happened next would not be an accident of emotion. It would be a choice. Every terrible decision begins with a story. Not the kind you tell others. The kind you tell yourself so you can sleep at night. I told myself I was being practical. That emotions had no place here. That this was about preventing greater harm. Julian's health continued to decline in small, believable ways. Fatigue. Migraines. Moments of disorientation he laughed off as age catching up. I encouraged him to see a doctor. I insisted, even. That part mattered to me. It made everything feel responsible. When the tests came back mostly normal, he seemed relieved and unsettled at the same time. So it's all in my head, he asked. "No," I said quickly. Stress can do strange things. Stress. Such a useful word. At home, I took over more of his routine. Cooking. Scheduling. Medication. He let me, gladly. Gratefully. As if surrender itself was a form of rest. "I don't know what I'd do without you," he said one night, half asleep. The words no longer warmed me. They weighed. I began to imagine myself as something necessary but temporary, like scaffolding. You don't mourn scaffolding when the building stands on its own. That was the story. Another story followed close behind. Julian would not survive abandonment, not this time. Not at this age. Not after giving so much of himself. I told myself that leaving him would be an act of violence. Staying forever would be another. So what remained? I hated how reasonable it began to sound. The pills were still locked away. I never touched them without him present. Not yet. I drew lines and convinced myself they mattered. I'm not a monster, I told myself. I'm just trapped. And trapped people imagine exits. The sister called again. She wanted to visit. Something in her voice made my stomach tighten. "She worries," Julian told me. "She always has." "About what?" I asked. He smiled faintly. "Being alone." The irony burned. That night, I dreamed I was standing at the edge of the sea in Greyhaven. The water was calm, glass-like. Julian stood beside me, smiling peacefully. "Just let go," he said. When I woke, my heart was racing, not from fear, but from something dangerously close to clarity. The next days felt sharpened. Every interaction carried double meaning. Every kindness felt rehearsed. Julian trusted me completely now. He drank the tea I made without question. Took the pills I handed him without counting. Love creates habits. Habits create vulnerability. Still, I hesitated. Because deep down, beneath all the stories and justifications, there was a simpler truth I refused to name. I was afraid of being ordinary again, afraid of struggling. Afraid of starting over without the protection his life provided. This wasn't just about him. It never had been. One evening, Julian sat across from me at the kitchen table and said, "Promise me something." "What?" I asked. "That if one day you stop loving me, don't disappear. Just tell me." The room felt suddenly very small. "I promise," I said. That was the worst lie yet. Because by then, I knew I was already disappearing. Not from his life, but from my own conscience, and once you lose sight of who you were trying to be, any ending can begin to feel acceptable. Even the unforgivable ones. 8. The most dangerous moments are not the violent ones. They are the gentle ones. The moments that feel almost kind. I became softer with Julian after that. Not distant. Not cold. Softer. I listened more carefully. I laughed more easily. I held his hand longer than necessary. If guilt had a texture, it would have felt like that, warm, aching, intimate. He mistook it for love deepening. Perhaps part of it was that we fell into a routine that felt strangely domestic. Mornings with quiet conversations. Afternoons spent apart. Evenings stitched together by shared meals and small, unremarkable stories. Normalcy is an excellent disguise. Julian's health remained unstable, but manageable. Some days were better than others. On bad days, he leaned on me more heavily, physically, emotionally. I didn't pull away. I told myself this was compassion. At night, when he slept, I lay awake beside him, studying the rise and fall of his chest. I memorized the shape of his breathing, the subtle sounds of comfort. It terrified me how familiar it all felt. I wondered when familiarity had become permission. There were moments, brief, piercing, when I nearly spoke. Nearly told him everything. Confessed my fear, my resentment, my exhaustion. But confessions are selfish when you don't intend to stay. Instead, I chose silence. Silence can feel like mercy when spoken words would only cause pain. Julian trusted my care completely now. If I suggested rest, he rested. If I insisted on quiet, he complied. His world had narrowed to the shape of my concern. I noticed how little he questioned anything anymore. Not because he was weak. Because he was tired. And tired people hand over control without realizing it. One evening, while washing dishes together, he said, "I feel safe with you." The plate slipped from my hands and shattered in the sink. "I'm sorry," I said quickly. He reached for me immediately. "It's nothing. Just a plate. Just a plate." But I stood there shaking, overwhelmed by the weight of what he'd said. Safe. That word had followed me my entire life, a promise I had chased, borrowed, and clung to. Now I was the one offering it. I wondered if safety given falsely was worse than cruelty given honestly. In the following days, I found myself moving through the house differently. More quietly. More deliberately. As if the walls themselves were listening. Every action carried intention now. Every kindness had an echo. Julian noticed my attentiveness and responded with gratitude so sincere it hurt. "You've been incredible," he said one night, touching my face. "I don't deserve you." The words cracked something open inside me. Because he was wrong. He deserved honesty. He deserved choice. And I was denying him both. The guilt came in waves, sudden, breath-stealing. I would excuse myself to the bathroom, grip the sink, and stare at my reflection. "This is temporary," I whispered. "This is kindness. This is the least painful way." The lies sounded thin even to me. There were nights I dreamed of running, packing a bag, leaving before dawn, disappearing into a city where no one knew my name or the shape of my guilt. But morning always came. And with it, Julian's quiet smile. His reliance. His fragile sense of stability, leaving now would shatter him. That was the thought that kept me still. That, and the growing fear that I had already gone too far to be forgiven, even by myself. One afternoon, Julian asked if I would stay home with him the following week. He wasn't feeling well, he said. Just for a few days. I nodded without hesitation. I was past hesitation. Inside, something went terribly calm. Because once you stop debating an action, once you stop asking whether it's right or wrong, what remains is not certainty, but commitment. And commitment, I was learning, is far more dangerous than doubt. That night, as Julian slept, I lay awake listening to the city breathe outside the window. Cars passed. Voices drifted. Life continued, indifferent and vast. I placed a hand over my chest and felt my heart racing, not with fear, but with something like mourning. Not for Julian. For the person I had been before I learned how easily love could be turned into a justification, and somewhere in that quiet, irreversible awareness, I understood something with terrible clarity. Whatever happened next, I would never be able to say. I didn't know what I was doing. Some nights don't belong to time. They stretch. They resist conclusion. They refuse to become memory. That night arrived quietly. No warning. No thunder. Just the ordinary weight of evening settling over the house. Julian had been tired all day. The kind of tired that makes conversation feel heavy and silence feel necessary. He smiled at me across the dinner table, apologetic. I hate being boring, he said. That you're not, I replied automatically. But I watched him more closely than usual. Every movement felt slowed, as if the world itself had decided to hold its breath. After dinner, we sat together in the living room. A documentary played softly on the television, neither of us really watching. His head rested against the back of the couch. His eyes closed and opened again, unfocused. "You don't have to stay up with me," he murmured. "You must be exhausted." I should have gone to bed. Instead, I stayed, because something inside me needed to see the night through, to its end, whatever that end might be. Julian dozed in and out of sleep, occasionally reaching for my hand as if to confirm I was still there. Each time, I held on a second longer than necessary. Touch can be an apology when words are impossible. At some point, he whispered my name. "Yes." I said immediately. "I'm glad you stayed," he said. "It feels quieter when you're here." The room felt unbearably still. That I wondered how many people have crossed irreversible lines not in moments of chaos, but in moments of quiet gratitude. The clock ticked loudly on the wall. I counted the seconds without meaning to. Time felt distorted, elastic, unreliable. Julian's breathing changed slightly as the night deepened. Not dramatically. Just enough for me to notice. I leaned closer, listening. Panic fluttered briefly in my chest, sharp and sudden. "Stop," a voice urged. "You can still stop," and for a moment, just one, I almost did. I stood up, heart racing, ready to wake him, ready to undo everything. But he stirred, reached out, and found my wrist. "Don't go," he said faintly. That was all it took. Not force. Not fear. Just the quiet request of someone who believed I was his anchor. I sat back down, the hours dragged. Outside, the city thinned into silence. Streetlights hummed. Somewhere far away, a siren passed and faded. Inside the house, everything narrowed to the space between us. I watched his chest rise and fall. Slower now. Uneven in a way that made my throat tighten. This wasn't how I had imagined it. There was no clarity. No release. Only a growing, suffocating awareness that whatever I was doing, or not doing, was already shaping the outcome. I thought of my mother leaving Greyhaven without a word. Of how silence can wound more deeply than confrontation. I thought of Julian's sister. Of the letters in the drawer. Of the echo he said never closed. My hands trembled. "I'm here," I whispered, though I wasn't sure who I was speaking to anymore, him, myself, or the version of me I was losing. At some point, the sky outside began to lighten. Dawn crept in slowly, indifferent to human decisions. Julian didn't wake. I told myself that rest can look like stillness. That peace can look like quiet. That I was overreacting. Denial is very convincing when panic would destroy you. I sat there until morning fully arrived, unable to move, unable to think beyond the simple fact that the night, the endless, unbearable night, had finally ended. And with it, something else had ended too. Not his life. Not yet. But the space in which I could still pretend this was all a misunderstanding. When I finally stood, my legs felt weak, unfamiliar, like I was walking out of someone else's body. That I in the bathroom mirror, my reflection looked older. Not aged by years, but by knowledge. I realized then that the worst part was not what might happen next. It was this. Whatever came after this night. I would live knowing that when the moment asked me who I was, I had answered. Morning has a way of exposing everything night tries to hide. Sunlight entered the house without permission, spilling across the floor, touching the furniture, resting briefly on Julian's still form, as if checking whether it was allowed to be there. I stood in the doorway for a long time before moving. Nothing looked different. That was the most disturbing part. The kettle still sat where I had left it. A book lay open on the table, a finger marking the page he never finished. Life had paused mid-sentence. That I told myself not to panic. Panic is loud. Panic attracts attention. Instead, I moved carefully, deliberately, as if the wrong step might cause the entire scene to collapse. I spoke his name. Once. Twice. My voice sounded wrong in the quiet, like it belonged to a stranger trespassing in someone else's life. No response. I touched his shoulder, lightly. The contact sent a shock through me, not because of what I felt, but because of what I didn't. This was no longer a night. This was a morning with consequences. I don't remember making the call. Only fragments remain, my voice too calm, the words carefully chosen, the way I avoided saying anything definite. Ambiguity felt safer. Help arrived quickly. Too quickly. The house filled with people whose faces I would later struggle to remember. Questions floated around me, overlapping, blurring. I answered when spoken to, nodded when expected. Shock is a remarkable shield. It lets you function while feeling nothing. They moved Julian gently, respectfully. Someone covered him. Someone else spoke in a low, professional tone I couldn't hear properly. I stood aside, invisible again. That part felt familiar. At some point, someone asked how long he had been unwell. I told them about the headaches. The fatigue. The tests. All true. Carefully true. Truth, when arranged properly, can resemble innocence. They asked if he lived alone. No, I said, I live here. The words landed heavily. Itself were listening. The sister arrived later. She looked smaller than I remembered. Tired. Her eyes searched the room, then found me. Something passed between us, not accusation, not comfort. Assessment. She hugged me, briefly. Her body was tense, uncertain. I'm glad he wasn't alone, she said. The sentence lodged itself painfully in my chest. I nodded, unable to speak. When they finally left, the house felt cavernous. Too quiet. Every sound, the refrigerator humming, the distant traffic, felt amplified. I sat at the kitchen table and stared at my hands. They looked the same. No blood. No tremor. Hands tell lies too, I realized. The rest of the day passed in fragments. Phone calls. Arrangements. Condolences that didn't know where to land. People spoke around me, not to me. I existed in the margins. That night, alone for the first time in months, I wandered through the house. Each room felt altered, not by absence, but by memory. The couch where we sat. The study with the letters. The bedroom where I had promised something I never meant. I lay down and waited for something, guilt, relief, horror. Nothing came. Instead, there was only fear. Not of what I had done, but of what might be seen. Because control, I was learning, does not end with the act. It fractures. Slips. Leaves traces. And somewhere beyond the walls of the house, the world was beginning to ask questions. Quiet ones. Polite ones. The most dangerous kind. That I closed my eyes and understood something with terrible clarity. The night had ended. But the story hadn't. Not even close. Suspicion doesn't arrive with sirens. It arrives with pauses. With looks that last half a second too long. With questions that feel rehearsed. With sympathy that doesn't quite reach the eyes. In the days that followed, people were very kind to me. That, more than anything, made me uneasy. They brought food. They spoke softly. They told me how devoted I had been, how lucky Julian was to have me there at the end. At the end. The phrase echoed that I learned quickly, that grief comes with an expected shape. You are allowed to be quiet, but not detached. Emotional, but not composed. Broken, but not functional. I studied the others and adjusted accordingly. I cried when spoken to. I stared into space when alone. I repeated the same phrases until they sounded natural. I still can't believe it. He'd been unwell for weeks. I just wish I'd noticed sooner. All true. All incomplete. Julian's sister stayed nearby. She didn't accuse me of anything, not directly. But she watched. I noticed how her gaze lingered on the kitchen shelves. The medicine cabinet. The study door. Once, she asked, "You were with him that night?" "Yes," I said. Too quickly. She nodded, slowly. "I'm glad he wasn't alone." Again that sentence. It followed me like a shadow. The authorities came later. Not urgently, casually. As if they were checking a box rather than opening a case. They asked about routines. About his health. About stress. They asked about me. How long had we been together? Did we argue? Had he seemed worried recently? I answered calmly. Carefully. I kept my hands folded, my voice steady. I had rehearsed none of it, which made it sound more convincing. But inside, something had begun to fracture, because every question carried a second meaning. And every answer felt like a performance balanced on a wire. At night, sleep deserted me. I replayed conversations endlessly, searching for cracks. I imagined alternative responses. Better pauses. Softer expressions. I started to fear ordinary things. A knock at the door. A phone vibrating unexpectedly. A stranger looking at me for too long. Guilt did not consume me the way people say it does, fear did. Fear of misremembering. Fear of contradiction. Fear that someone would notice how controlled my grief was. One afternoon, while sorting through Julian's papers, I found a note I hadn't seen before. Just a few lines, written in his careful handwriting. If anything happens to me, please take care of him. He carries more than he shows. I sat down hard, the air knocked out of my lungs. He had seen me, not everything. But enough. The note wasn't an accusation. It was a kindness. And kindness, in that moment, felt unbearable. I burned the note that evening, watching the paper curl into itself, the words disappearing into ash. I told myself it was private. That it wasn't meant for anyone else. But even as I did it, I knew the truth. I was no longer protecting him, that I was protecting the story. In the weeks that followed, life tried to return to normal. Classes resumed. People stopped asking how I was doing. That was worse. Because silence gives the mind room to invent. I began to notice how easily my thoughts turned against me. How every memory felt suspect. How even moments of real tenderness now looked staged in hindsight. I didn't know anymore where care ended and calculation began. One evening, standing alone in the house, I realized something chilling. I was no longer afraid of being caught. I was afraid of being understood. Because if someone truly saw the shape of my choices, the fear, the need, the justifications, they might decide that none of it mattered. That whatever story I told myself would never be enough. There comes a moment when memory stops behaving. It no longer lines up neatly. It resists order. It changes shape depending on how you look at it. That moment found me quietly. I would be washing a cup and suddenly forget whether I had already rinsed it. I would reread the same paragraph 3 times and still not know what it said. I would wake in the middle of the night convinced I had heard Julian speak my name. Grief, I told myself, everyone says grief does this. But grief is usually loud. Mine was precise. I began questioning my own recollections. Had Julian really asked me to promise not to disappear? Had I imagined the way his breathing changed that night? Had there been a moment, a real, undeniable moment, when I could have changed everything? I couldn't find it. The past felt edited. Cropped. As if my mind had decided which scenes were safe to keep and which ones had to blur. Sometimes I remembered myself as careful. Sometimes as passive. Sometimes as already gone. Each version felt equally convincing. I avoided the house as much as I could. When I returned, it felt smaller, as if the walls had inched closer together. Sounds echoed strangely. The floorboards spoke too loudly under my feet. In the bedroom, I avoided the mirror. When I finally looked, I barely recognized the face staring back. Not because it was unfamiliar, but because it was too composed that I practiced expressions. Sadness. Confusion. Fatigue. None of them felt like lies anymore. That frightened me. One afternoon, I caught myself narrating my own life silently, as if preparing to explain it to someone else. I did what anyone would have done. I stayed. I cared. The sentences repeated until they lost meaning. I started writing things down, not in a journal, but on scraps of paper. Times, conversations, small details. Proof that things had happened the way I remembered them. But the notes contradicted each other. On one paper, I had written, "He was calm." On another, "He seemed afraid." Both were in my handwriting. I didn't know which version belonged to the truth. Julian's sister called once more. She asked if we could talk, not urgently, just, soon. Her voice was gentle. Controlled. After the call ended, I sat for a long time holding the phone, staring at nothing. I realized then that the fear had changed. Before, I was afraid of discovery. Now, I was afraid of conversation. Because conversation requires consistency. And I no longer trusted my own. At night, I dreamed of doors I couldn't open. Of hallways that looped back into themselves. Of Julian standing at a distance, watching me, not accusing, not angry. Just watching. When I woke, my chest hurt with something like mourning, not for him, but for certainty. There was a time when I believed I knew who I was. Now, every version felt provisional. I wondered if this was the real punishment, not exposure, not consequence, but fragmentation. To live inside a story you can no longer fully believe, yet cannot escape. Standing in the kitchen one evening, I whispered aloud, "I didn't mean to." The words sounded hollow. Meaning, I was learning, does not undo impact, and somewhere beneath the confusion, beneath the fractured memories and rehearsed grief, a quieter realization waited patiently. It no longer mattered what I intended, only what remained. There is a difference between truth and honesty. Truth is what happened. Honesty is what you allow yourself to see. For a long time, I survived by confusing the two. When Julian's sister came to see me, I was prepared. I had rehearsed the conversation in my head 100 times, calm voice, lowered eyes, the right balance of grief and distance. She sat across from me at the small cafe near the river. The same river Julian loved. The same river he said made the city feel anchored. She didn't accuse me. That was the problem. Instead, she said, "I keep thinking, he trusted people too easily." I nodded, slowly. "He always wanted to be needed," she continued. "Sometimes I think he confused that with love." The words landed gently. Too gently. I realized then that she wasn't here for answers. She was here for understanding, and for the first time, something inside me loosened, not enough to confess, but enough to admit a truth I had been avoiding. "I didn't know how to leave," I said quietly. She looked at me, waiting. "I mean, I didn't know how to change things without destroying him." That was as close as I came. She didn't press. She didn't ask follow-up questions. She simply nodded, as if that sentence explained more than I intended. "Sometimes," she said, "people stay too long because leaving feels cruel." I thought of my mother. Of Greyhaven. Of disappearing without explanation. "Yes," I said. "Sometimes." When she left, I sat there for a long time, watching the water move past the city without memory or judgment. I realized then what the real truth was, the one I had avoided because it didn't make me look innocent or monstrous. I had wanted relief. Not freedom. Not escape. Relief from responsibility. Relief from expectation. Relief from being someone's anchor. I told myself stories about kindness, about protection, about inevitability. But beneath all of them was a simpler desire. I wanted the weight to stop. And wanting that didn't make me evil. But it didn't make me blameless either. That night, back in the house, I packed a small bag. Not to run, just to feel the shape of leaving. Clothes. A book. Nothing essential. I stood in the doorway of the bedroom and looked once more at the space where Julian had slept. "I stayed," I whispered. I really did. The words didn't answer anything. They never do. I left the bag by the door and sat down instead. I didn't know whether I was preparing to go, or testing whether I still could. Outside, the city continued as it always had. People loved, left, failed, survived. No one paused for my certainty. And that was when I understood the final, uncomfortable truth. What happened between Julian and me would never resolve into a single story. Not for the police. Not for his sister. Not even for me. Some endings don't close. They remain open. Not as a question of guilt or innocence, but as a reflection of how far a person can go, while still believing they are acting out of care. There are nights that do not belong to time. They stretch. They echo. They refuse to end, no matter how many mornings pass after them. This was one of those nights. I never left the house. The bag stayed by the door, untouched, like a question I was afraid to answer. Instead, I walked through the room slowly, noticing things I had avoided for months, the faint mark on the wall where Julian had leaned his head while laughing, the uneven floorboard near the window he promised to fix, the silence that felt louder than any argument we ever had. Silence is not empty. It is crowded with everything you refuse to say. I sat on the floor and let the memories come, not in order, not gently. Julian standing in the rain, smiling like pain was a minor inconvenience. Julian asking, "You won't disappear, will you?" Julian believing me when I said, "No." I had never lied outright. That was the cruelest part. I had only delayed the truth until it became unrecognizable. Outside, the street lamp flickered. For a moment, the room felt unreal, like a stage after the audience has gone home. No applause. No judgment. Just evidence that something happened here. I wondered, briefly, if this was what punishment looked like. Not prison. Not exposure. But continuation. Living. In the early hours before dawn, I opened the window. Cold air rushed in, sharp and honest. Somewhere in the distance, the river moved, indifferent, unstoppable. I thought of all the ways this story could be told. In one version, I was a victim of circumstance. In another, a quiet villain. In another, simply a person who stayed too long and left too late. None of them were complete. I understood then that truth does not arrive as a verdict. It arrives as weight. And I would carry it. The city woke slowly. Cars passed. A dog barked. Someone laughed far away, unaware of how close they were to a life that had broken without noise. I picked up the bag at last. Then I put it down again. Not because I had decided to stay. And not because I had chosen to leave. But because some choices lose their clarity once you understand their cost. Before the sun fully rose, I wrote one sentence on a piece of paper and placed it on the table. I am not asking to be forgiven. I didn't sign it. Names are only necessary when you expect to be found. As I stepped outside, the door closing softly behind me, I realized something that felt almost like peace. Whatever version of this story survives, it will never belong entirely to anyone else. Not to Julian. Not to his sister. Not to the people who will speculate, analyze, and simplify. It belongs to the space between intention and outcome, between care and control. Between staying and leaving. And somewhere, in that space, I will continue to exist. Not innocent. Not condemned. But awake. The night did not end. It simply learned how to look like morning.